All right, everyone. Welcome to the sixth session of our ongoing series, Lessons in Resilience from the Holocaust and Genocide. Today, we are honored to focus on the remarkable resilience of Armenian genocide refugees, featuring Tali Nates and Asya Darbayan. We extend our heartfelt gratitude to our partner, the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, for their invaluable support in making this event possible. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, I am Ellen Resnick, the Educational Programs and Outreach Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. At CWB, we are proud to be a beacon of experiential learning dedicated to enriching minds and hearts through education. As we celebrate 13 years of groundbreaking programming, our commitment to fostering inclusivity and social justice remains stronger than ever. Over the past 3 years, we have hosted a remarkable 604 programs with over 87,000 participants from 84 countries and 46 United States. While those numbers are impressive, it is the personal narratives, the connections formed, and the profound transformations experienced by our participants that truly define our impact. We are deeply grateful for the support over the past decade. Your participation and engagement help us continue our mission to open minds and hearts through transformative educational experiences. If you would like to make a donation, I will drop the link into the chat for you now. Feel free to send any questions directly to me via the chat, and we'll do our best to address them all. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's event, Tali Nates, who will formally introduce today's guest. Tali is the founder and director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. Born into a family of Holocaust survivors, Tali brings a deeply personal and profound perspective to Holocaust and genocide education. Her dedication to preserving memory and promoting reconciliation resonates in everything she does. Tali's extensive contribution to academic discourse and her advocacy for human rights have made her an indispensable figure in global efforts to combat anti-Semitism and promote Holocaust remembrance. Her involvement in international initiatives, including her advisory role in the Malmo Forum, highlights her tireless work to foster resilience in the face of historical atrocities. Her accolades include the prestigious Goethe Medal and reflect her unwavering commitment to shaping the narrative of resistance and resilience in the modern world. Before I turn the program formally over to Tali, I'd also like to take a moment to wish each of you a Shana Tova. As we welcome in the new year, we are reminded of the hope and renewal that Rosh Hashanah brings. This year, however, our hearts are heavy with the ongoing war in Israel. In the face of these challenges, may this season inspire us to stand united, pursue peace, and continue to support one another. Wishing you and your loved ones a year filled with health, strength, and resilience. May the coming years bring this for Israel and for everyone. And with that, I will turn the program formally over to Tali. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ellen. It is a pleasure to welcome you all today. It's fantastic to see Pinchas Guta, our wonderful survivor from Toronto. Hello, Pinchas. So lovely to see you and to see other friends from all over the world here with us tonight. And it is so important, the topic that we are covering in this series, the resilience, the resistance, the human spirit. And what we're doing, and it's really unique, this series is very, very unique, is to look at this resilience and resistance to what is happening around you, not only through the case studies that we know more about, like the Holocaust or the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, but we also this time invited experts to speak to us about the genocide that we will talk about today, the Armenian genocide, but also about the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and specifically the genocide in Srebrenica, which we will speak again about next month. So tonight we have a real expert and a friend to join us from New Jersey, from Cheng, the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights and Genocide Education at Brookdale Community College, and that is Dr. Asya Darbayan, who I know personally since 2014, when we were both at the Salzburg Global Seminar in Austria and tackling the issues of how do you teach about the Holocaust and genocide in today's world? What lessons do you learn from the Holocaust and from genocide? And it is such a pleasure to see how you incorporated your interest in your own background in the study of the Armenian genocide, in refugees and the resilience of refugees, to the wider issue of how do you study about the Holocaust, about human rights, and about genocide. So officially, to welcome Asya Darbinyan to our series, and to tell you that she earned her PhD in history from the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. And that is where some of our other speakers in the series came from. And I see Joanna Sliva here joining us, who gave a wonderful, wonderful talk about her latest book, which we enjoyed in this series. But others as well spoke in this series about it. Asya's full bio will be posted as always in the chat, and I will manage the discussion and conversation after, so feel free to send your questions, your comments to Ellen, and we will have a lively conversation after Asya share with us her expertise about the remarkable resilience of the Armenian genocide refugees. Asya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Tali. It's an honor to be part of this program and to join this list of amazing scholars that have delivered talks. Thank you for the generous introduction and for reminding me of the Salzburg seminar. That was a wonderful experience. Without further ado, I will share my screen and start my presentation. Okay, sorry about this. Okay, great. I hope everyone is able to see my slides. And today, I will reflect on the successful attempt of Armenian refugee survivors, including women, children, to self-organize and help each other during the Armenian genocide. But first, allow me to introduce you to the history of Armenian genocide very briefly. I would say almost in bullet points, so that those of you in this virtual audience who haven't had the chance to learn about it yet may feel more comfortable during the discussion of refugee experiences. So, genocide. What is genocide? Genocide is a crime. It is a term coined by an international lawyer, Raphael Lemkin, to define, condemn, and punish a crime that had no name. Yet genocide is so much more than just a crime or a term. It is an attack on the lives, homes, culture, identity, agency, and dignity of a people. Genocide is an experience and a process that does not begin or end with the act of killing. It impacts generations. Each genocide is unique for the people who experience it, who have to overcome that trauma and deal with its consequences, who remember and commemorate it. The Armenian genocide, orchestrated and systematically implemented by the Ottoman Turkish government under the cover of the First World War, was a disaster that inflicted tremendous suffering and pain upon a people, that took over 1.5 million lives, triggered huge population movements, and left hundreds of thousands of Armenians, as well as Assyrians and Greeks, without home and hope. Without further ado, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, both geographically and historically. This journey will take us somewhere right at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Present-day Republic of Armenia is a small, independent, democratic state surrounded by such neighbors as Turkey, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Iran, and it is right next door to Russia. Back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Armenians did not have an independent state, and the country and its people were divided between the Ottoman and Russian empires. The Ottoman Empire, which ruled over vast territories from North Africa to Europe, Asia Minor, and the Caucasus in the past, was gradually declining, and by the 19th century was called the sick man of Europe. The European powers kept pushing the sultans, the heads of the empire, to implement reforms that, according to them, would help the Ottomans to modernize and prevent the country's further decline. These reforms entailed granting equal rights to all Muslim and non-Muslim subjects of the empire. See, Armenians, Assyrians, Greeks, who were Christians, as well as Jews, were secondary citizens in the Ottoman Empire, deprived of the right to serve in the army or carry weapons, testify in court, and they were double or triple taxed by the government, local municipal powers, and the Kurdish landlords or tribesmen. While the sultans initially welcomed those calls of European powers for change and agreed to some reforms during the Tanzimat period, in practice, they were reluctant to implement those. Instead, they reinforced the system of inferiority of non-Muslim subjects. If the latter refused to obey the discriminating rules and practices or attempted to resist any attack on their families, properties, possessions, these actions were labeled as treacherous and were followed by pogroms, massacres, looting, and plunder. In the 1890s, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, also known in the West as the Bloody Sultan, was once again urged to implement the promised reforms. Yet, instead, throughout 1894-96, about 300,000 Armenians in various parts of the empire fell victim to massacres on his watch. European ambassadors in Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, shocked by the bloodshed in the streets of the imperial capital, sent a note to Abdul Hamid demanding immediate end of massacres. The killings stopped, but this toxic atmosphere of inequality, hostility towards the non-Muslims, and most importantly, the impunity would pave the way for the new crimes against humanity in the Ottoman state and eventually peak during the First World War in a form of systematically implemented genocide. Now let's fast forward to 1908. In 1908, the Young Turks staged a coup in Ottoman Empire and restored its constitution. The non-Muslim subjects celebrated this in every corner of the empire with hopes for long-awaited equality, freedom, and justice. For instance, Armenians started reopening their educational institutions, participating in political and social life more actively, and even were allowed to serve in the army. Meanwhile, for the conservative Muslim population, this new era of constitutional order threatened their traditional relationship with the Armenians and other non-Muslim subjects. No wonder just a year after the coup, in spring 1909, another wave of massacres against Armenians took place in Adana, accompanied by plunder and destruction of the city. Gradually, the attitude of the new government and the leading Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, towards the Armenians and their political parties that had supported the Young Turkish Revolution started changing. On the eve of the First World War, Ottoman Empire had about 2 million Armenian subjects, while the entire population was over 17 million. Hence, Armenians were a small minority to present any kind of real threat to the empire. Yet, the losses in Balkan wars, Turkey lost almost all of its European territories, as you may see on this map, had a devastating emotional impact on the young Turkish leaders. And at the beginning of World War I, Armenians, as well as Assyrians, Greeks, were seen as internal enemies, a threat to the integrity of the Ottoman state. Another reason for Turkish leadership's growing hostility towards Armenians was the reform project. Inspired by the success of Balkan states, Armenians were asking the Ottoman government for the long-promised reforms. Of course, it's crucial to understand that unlike the Balkan states, Armenians did not push for separation or independence. All they requested was the promised reforms, the equal rights. And while the European powers were in the middle of discussing the reform project, the First World War waged in the fall of 1914. The reforms remained on the paper, and the Ottoman government used the cover of the war to bring the Armenian question to its final solution. We are looking at the map of the Armenian genocide. It shows the main killing sites, deportation routes, concentration camps. We will come back to this map again. The genocide was carried out stage by stage. First, Ottomans aimed to deprive the Armenians of leadership and of their will or ability to unite and to resist. This process included the arrest of prominent Armenian intellectuals in Constantinople on April 24, 1915. That is why April 24 is the day of the official commemoration of the Armenian genocide. These intellectuals were then deported, transferred to Ankara, present-day Turkish capital, and eventually killed. Another important step for the Ottoman government in the implementation of the genocide was the disarmament of the Armenian men conscripted to Ottoman army. When the war started, Ottoman Armenians joined the Ottoman army to fight against the enemies of Ottoman Empire. However, in reality, they were drafted into the labor battalions already from October 1914 and either died of exhaustion and starvation while working on road and railway constructions, or were taken away in groups and executed. The deportation of Armenian women, children, and the elderly to the Syrian deserts was the next stage. The government justified this action as a military necessity and called it relocation. Yet, according to the reports of numerous foreign witnesses, as well as the accounts of survivors, these were death marches. Those who survived the deportation were placed in the concentration camps in Aleppo and the adjacent areas. Many were eventually attacked as well and massacred. It was the second phase of the genocide, extending from summer to December 1916, resulting in the destruction of Armenians in the concentration camps of Syrian deserts, the black circles on the map that you see. The genocidal methods varied from place to place. For instance, Armenians of the Black Sea port city Trabzon, about 15,000 of them, were deported, but many were arrested, taken by ship out to sea and drowned, which again, you may notice on the map, where you see the red arrows pointing at the sea. We're talking about regional practices. If from Western and Central provinces, Armenians were deported to the deserts, in Eastern provinces of Ottoman Empire, the scene was different. That's why you see the large red circles of killing sites on the map towards the eastern border. Most of Armenians in those areas were killed in their home vilayets. Very few were deported. Local participation in the killing and looting of Armenian population was a crucial aspect of the Armenian genocide. There were incentives for mass participation in the genocidal process allowed by the government. The so-called spoils of war, plundering of Armenian property, near free access to females and minors. The CUP openly encouraged Ottoman Muslim households to incorporate Armenian women and children with the goal to remake them into proper Ottoman Muslims. So now that we have some better understanding of the situation on the ground, let's talk about refugees and their role. And how do we learn about that? For many years, Armenian genocide research has focused on such texts as official documents, international reactions to the events in the printing press, and foreign eyewitness testimonies. They aimed at proving the crime of genocide. By analyzing foreign sources, scholars largely neglected the voices of the survivors. As we know, Turkish state's continuous denial of Armenian genocide has had an impact too. Even when language was not an obstacle, scholars focused on Ottoman and Western sources, avoiding Armenian documents and accounts so as not to be accused of using tainted, biased, or manipulated material. Hence, those who actually went through the hardships of forced displacement, attacks on their houses and families, rape, abduction, forced conversion, starvation, exhaustion, and epidemics were marginalized, and their words were considered less worthy for scholarly analysis. Consequently, thousands of testimonies of survivors, as well as memoirs and diaries, remained in archives scattered all over the world, in historian Alexandra Garbarini's words, gathering dust on the shelves. In my talk today, I focus on testimonies by or about the refugee survivors, because the survivors' accounts demonstrate the multiplicity of experiences of Armenian refugees, and because doing so restores the agency of people at times seen or described as faceless and nameless waves. Earlier, I mentioned about regional practices of genocide. In eastern provinces closest to eastern border of Ottoman Empire, instead of being deported, many Armenians were killed in their homes, and many who survived left everything behind and escaped in panic. Now, when we have a look at this map, it shows population movements in those areas specifically. About 200,000 refugees crossed the Ottoman border into Russian imperial territories and reached the Caucasus in July-August 1915 because of those regional practices of genocide and the military developments on the Caucasus battlefront of the First World War. These refugees walked over 120 miles in deserted mountainous regions. Many died from starvation, exhaustion, and diseases. Even when they reached Caucasus, they needed accommodation and help. And the first responders to this refugee crisis in the Caucasus were the locals, Armenian villagers, who sheltered the refugees in their houses and barns and comforted them until the relief agencies intervened. Among those first responders were also the religious institutions that provided monastery buildings for refugees and orphans, as well as individual donors and philanthropists whose fundraising campaigns, donations, and participation saved countless lives. Armenian intellectuals in Caucasus and in other parts of Russian Empire raised awareness about the extent of the crisis, and some even personally took responsibility for orphan care and refugee relief. For instance, celebrated Armenian writer Hovhannes Tumanyan, together with his daughter Nevard, who worked as a nurse, assisted the orphans in Echmiadzin, Yerevan, and elsewhere. I quote, "Roads and villages, as well as the forests in Echmiadzin, were flooded by refugees," lamented Nevard. Then she described her father's relief efforts and the health issues he faced, yet he continued the work. A friend and frequent visitor at the Tumanyan household was Armenian poet Van Deryan, who came up with a unique initiative, collecting testimonies of orphan survivors from Van. Writing about the importance of children's eyewitness testimonies, Donald and Lorna Miller note that, and I quote, "Rather than seeing children's perspective as a liability, we believe that this point of view offers a unique opportunity to understand human tragedy as it affects those who are typically voiceless in the society," end quote. It is almost as if building on that same argument, about a century earlier, in January 1916, poet Derian collected the accounts of the Armenian orphans from Van about their experiences before, during, and after 1915 July. Only very recently, Derian's great-grandson published those accounts. Before the publication of this volume, the stories written by Armenian orphans from Van were kept at the museum in Yerevan, mislisted as Vahan Derian student's notebook. Derian asked the children, survivors of genocide in this orphanage, and it was an orphan school in Yerevan, to write down brief accounts, put their name and age at the bottom of the page, and they were from 10 to 15 years old. And this collection was not very well organized, but it also wasn't edited. The author, the refugee children, titled their accounts, and the poet Vahan Derian kept their titles intact. Most orphans mention a few details about their past or family in Van, and focused on the July 1915, on the Exodus. They emphasized the hardships of packing in panic and leaving their homes and everything behind. A number of orphans remembered the route of retreat. They talked about being attacked by Kurdish gangs and described the suffering and death of their fellow refugees on the way to Caucasus. Like 14-year-old boy Zaven, writing, I quote, "Overcoming those hardships and the suffering, we reached Iktir. Some died in Iktir, others in Echmiadzin, and many came and died in this foreign town of Yerevan, abandoning their fatherland." End quote. While the refugee children's accounts are not very structured, they contain brief but distinct reflections on their own feelings and conditions after their exodus in various areas in Caucasus. Sirarpi, a 13-year-old girl, talked about the miserable situation in which the refugees found themselves after their escape to the Caucasus, and she emphasized self-help and the role local Armenians played in their day-to-day survival. These brief reflections of orphans demonstrate both the devastating condition of the children and the challenges they continued to face after the Exodus. These accounts also show the level of self-awareness of these children in distress. While their memories of suffering and loss were very fresh and painful, these orphans realized the challenges of their situation, complained about the shortcomings of the relief work, and at the same time appreciated the assistance provided to them. Not all children found shelter in orphanages, like the ones that Derian encountered in Yerevan. Many spent weeks or even months wandering alone or in bands, hiding in forests and mountains and caves, subsisting on grass, roots, insects, covered only in rags or totally naked. Some of them, those who remembered, tried to return to their villages. Children themselves played a crucial role in self-organization, and many showed strength and willingness to overcome obstacles, as evidenced, for example, by Maynard Owen Williams's article, "Between Massacres in Van." The article was published in the National Geographic magazine in August 1919 during the nationwide fundraising campaign in the United States in support of survivors. The article was about the massacres and self-defense in Van in 1915 and included 3 photos of Armenian children aged 8 to 12, whom Williams called a grotesque group of tiny lads. They had arrived from Artemet, which was a village 6 miles away from the city of Van. They have walked there carrying wooden guns and requesting real ones in order to return to fight and protect their homes and relatives from the enemy. The boys' actions, their courage, persistence, and strong spirit were unforgettable for the author. On his way through the eastern regions of Ottoman Empire, traveling alongside Armenian volunteers attempting to rescue children and women abducted by local Muslims, French journalist Henri Barby came across a striking scene. They noticed a small drove of bullocks moving towards them. When those silhouettes approached, It appeared to be a caravan comprised of 4 donkeys carrying several children, girls, and boys. The leader of the caravan, an 8-year-old boy, explained that they were Armenians, had escaped from Kurds, found the donkeys in the mountains, and were returning to their village. When Balbi and the volunteers learned that the children were headed towards a village that had been destroyed, they tried to explain it to the children. Balbi wrote, I quote, "The child, the leader, shrugged and with the confidence of an adult responded, 'We can always find something. Besides, this is better than staying with the Kurds.'" End quote. Barbie noticed how the boy was extremely calm. I quote, "He has seen so much blood. He has such an important mission to accomplish, to bring those little ones to their homes, so he does not get emotional," Barbie explained. Soghomon Tehlirian was among the Armenian activists working for the Orphan Rescue Initiative in the eastern regions of Ottoman Empire in 1916. He recalled a 14-year-old orphan who had helped his sister to escape from Kurdish captivity and then had carried her on his back all the way to the Caucasus. These orphans were daring, smart, resilient, wrote Tehlirian. In his memoir, he also recalled how these children would not show any emotions when talking about their parents' or other relatives' death and would describe it in just one word: murdered. This attests to the coping mechanisms children developed, not giving in to despair. So whether we call it resistance in the diverse forms it may assume or coping mechanisms, the decisions made and actions taken by the children, abandoned, famished, exhausted from endless wandering, are critical examples of agency, resilience, and self-organization. Community leaders, intellectuals, politicians, and activists were not the only ones appealing for help and raising awareness about the condition of refugees. Facing terrible conditions, the refugees themselves initiated appeals and petitions to various local and Tsarist officials and authorities explaining their critical needs. One such petition was addressed to Chief Commissioner for Refugees in the Caucasus, General Tamamshev, by the refugees from Mush and Van that were residing at that time in Tiflis in November 1916. Handwritten and signed by 64 refugees, the petition stated the following: "Since May of the current year, 1916, we, the refugees, have not received our allowance, governmental assistance, as a result of which our current condition is very critical, as food and essentials become more and more expensive every day, and we don't have any means to purchase them. The cold descends on us while we are not provided with essentials and warm clothes. Death is hanging over us. The cold, hunger, and need make us anxious, Your Excellency. With this plea, we are asking to help us, the unfortunate victims of war, and not let us, the survivors of Turkish atrocities, perish in front of the eyes of benevolent activists of Russian Empire. Addressing our motion to you, we are asking to provide us with an allowance and warm clothes." End of quote. While not all of those voices were heard, and not every letter and petition brought about immediate changes in the condition of refugees, many such appeals led to discussions among the local and central authorities. The case of refugees in the city of Tiflis was noteworthy since the government responded, and positively, evidence that efforts of these resilient refugees and local organizations achieved tangible results. An important example of self-help and self-organization among Armenian refugees during the war and genocide was securing education for the children and orphans. The children were sheltered in orphanages all over the Caucasus. Many adult refugees settled there and not able to participate in agricultural work or find employment in artisan workshops took the responsibility of educating the refugee orphans. A report sent in April 1916 showed the situation in schools in Tiflis gubernia. In many settlements, refugee children were taught 2 classes of religion, 6 classes of Armenian language, 4 classes of arithmetic, 3 classes of drawing, as well as calligraphy, vocal and physical training each week. These refugee schools operated due to the teachers' dedication and, of course, thanks to financial support provided by the Armenian committees. And those committees also sent textbooks and other printed products to the schools. Each school had 1 or at most 2 teachers, predominantly refugees from Van, and depending on the size of the settlement, from 40 to 120 refugee students. Russian language was also taught in refugee schools if there were competent teachers to fulfill that task. Fluency in Russian was important for young Armenians who were forced to flee their lives and settle in Caucasus. The language was necessary for adjusting to their new environment, as well as for their further education and employment. Many churches provided their parish schools buildings for the refugee students, and the number of towns and villages with refugee schools opened by Armenian committees in 1915-16 was 40. During the following year, with the financial support of Imperial Russian organizations, the number of schools, teachers, and students increased. After finding asylum in towns and villages in Caucasus, young girls and boys were treated by medics, bathed, fed, and then transferred to different orphanage schools and workshops. While in schools, they were taught religion, languages, as we saw. In workshops, the older children were taught crafts. For instance, Sokrat Mkrtchan from Bitlis described his experience in the Ashtarak orphanage, emphasizing, and I quote, the good education, both practical and theoretical, end quote, that he received there. Girls mastered sewing and handiwork. Boys learned such trades as shoemaking and tailoring. Some of the young girls who learned from nurses and doctors dispatched from central relief stations soon successfully replaced them. A number of workshops, such as the one called Meru, which means bee, run with the support of the Armenian Women's Society in Tiflis, employed trained young girls and refugee women who produced supplies, clothes, and shoes for thousands of war victims, fellow refugees, and displaced persons. Education through various refugee shelter schools, church parish schools, and workshops for older students helped the children in a number of ways. Acquiring elementary knowledge of general subjects or vocational training, these children would be prepared for the next stage in their lives and become self-supportive once released from the orphanage. Teaching Armenian language, literature, religion courses, Armenian teachers in the Caucasus, both local Armenians and refugee teachers, made an effort to keep the orphans close to their roots, which on the one hand was crucial for pragmatic reasons, the future and survival of Armenian nation, and on the other hand provided the orphans who had lost everyone, and in some cases forgotten the names of their villages and their own, with a certain sense of community and belonging. Ionesyan, the representative of the Baku Committee of Relief, described how during the several hours children spent at school, I quote, they were pulled out of that terrifying, oppressive atmosphere where they saw nothing but sorrow and need, end quote. Armenians played a major role in providing necessary financial support for all the relief and rescue operations, including the search and liberation or rescue of Armenian women and children from Turkish and Kurdish captivity. Sebastatsi Murat, a celebrated Armenian activist, formed a group of young Armenians who were entrusted with the task of liberating abducted Armenian women and children. They started the project known as One Armenian, One Gold, which referred to the payment of 1 Ottoman lira for 1 liberated Armenian, and the group formed by Sebastatsi Murat also established contacts with the Kurdish Ağas, the local tribesmen. Through those channels, many Armenians from various regions were liberated and transferred back to Armenian communities. Armyanski Vesnik magazine reported that the total number of Armenians liberated and transferred through Dersim to Erzincan within the framework of One Gold, One Armenian initiative was about 7,000 by June 1917. This initiative also was successful because of the financial support of Armenian communities and their grassroots movements in various regions of Russia. Numerous children sent envelopes with enclosed donations to liberate Armenians from Kurdish captivity. In her letter, handwritten in Armenian, addressed to the Armyansky Vestnik editor, which also had 90 rubles enclosed, second grade student from Astrakhan, Vartuhi Masumyan, explained that she, I quote, wanted to liberate 5 people. She also was trying to hold them accountable because she requested to send her the names of those helped to liberate. She wanted receipts. And that handwritten letter was published by the editor. You see that letter here in Armyansky Vestnik. So, throughout 1914-1917, about 300,000 Armenians from eastern territories of Ottoman Empire, abandoning their homes and fleeing to the Caucasus and Russian Empire, became refugees. This group of refugees was comprised of people who had faced countless physical hardships because of violent attacks, extreme weather conditions, numerous epidemics, and starvation during the population movements. Moreover, they were in perpetual grief and sorrow, inflicted by the immense psychological trauma, sometimes exceeding their ability to cope. Yet many of the refugees, both adults and children, provided quite extensive accounts of their experiences, exploring the testimonies of Armenian refugees and orphans, as well as the accounts of other witnesses of these developments, allows us to portray a more nuanced picture of Armenian refugees in contrast to the homogeneous and faceless waves of people described in most of the reports prepared by relief agencies or governmental organizations. We see that many refugees were quite helpful and active in classroom and workshops, teaching and training refugee children. Furthermore, many children were self-reliant and demonstrated a great sense of self-organization and even leadership when necessary. Emphasizing the successful attempts of Armenian refugees to self-organize, the tremendous operations of Armenian volunteers to liberate abducted Armenian women and children, the philanthropic actions of intellectuals, and the generous donations of Armenian communities, I aimed at highlighting the role Armenians themselves played during their struggle for survival in a time of crisis. What could be better example of their resilience? I will conclude here, and I look forward to your questions.
And thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating. And I think just to highlight a few things, and we have wonderful questions and comments to discuss, but just to highlight the fact that you, in your very important research, looked at stories of life rather than just the moment of death. And I think where a lot of the research and books that covers the Armenian genocide looks at numbers and at the killing and the cruelty, what you did was really to show the resilience, even of little children. I mean, the donkey and the children, what an amazing, amazing story that can show so much of that history. I also thought, because this series looks at the Holocaust, at Rwanda, at Bosnia, I thought about so much that you can connect between those histories. You started by speaking about massacres that took place even before the genocide during the First World War. And of course, before the horrific events of the Holocaust, for many, many decades, you saw pogroms and massacres happening mainly in Eastern Europe, and of course before that many other a persecution in targeting of the Jewish population in Europe. You spoke, for example, about labor battalions, and that was so strong because during the Holocaust, you have in Hungary or in Romania the same phenomena of bringing Jews into those labor battalions, and they are killed in the thousands in those labor battalions. I also thought about Rwanda and the massacres, the many massacres that happened before 1994 in the genocide. So I think your similarities and connections to the series, and on top of that, the resilience that you spoke about is very, very important. And we have a lot of questions, but maybe I would start with the trauma, because you spoke about many stories of children. And we have here a really important question about how did the trauma experienced by the Armenian orphans influence future generations, particularly in terms of family dynamics, intergenerational trauma, and the preservation of Armenian culture and memory, and how we see it today more than 100 more than 100 years after.
Thank you, Tali. Those parallels that you mentioned. So Change has a permanent exhibit. It's called Journeys Beyond Genocide, the Human Experience. And that's exactly what we do in our exhibit, because we talk about the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, and the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda by looking into human experiences, life, and not the death, not the victimization, but how human beings in all these different parts of the world, in different periods of time, dealt with the trauma, how, first of all, what kind of lives they had before, full, engaging, happy, beautiful, complicated, right? And then we go into details of them experiencing the trauma, going through it, making certain choices, and then eventually rebuilding their lives, creating new communities. So I totally agree with you. I think this whole series is wonderful, that brings together all these different topics and shows those common elements, pretty much like we do here at Change. And going to the question about trauma, this is a very important question, which is still something that in case of Armenian genocide needs to be studied more. Because as I mentioned in my talk, unfortunately, a lot of the research, predominantly on Armenian genocide, used to be focused on proving that the genocide was a genocide. And because of that, it took a lot of the focus of great scholars from those personal experiences, from those deep, important questions, into the front lines of bottling the denial and proving numbers and dates and showing perpetration and focusing on foreigners' proofs of what had happened. In the meantime, what actually happened to the survivors, how they dealt with their intergenerational trauma, because this is an intergenerational trauma, because Armenian genocide is part of the identity of Armenian people today. You will rarely meet an Armenian person who will not talk about Armenian genocide as part of their family history. I'm not exception to that, unfortunately, either. But it's also about how Armenians all over the world think about their past and fear of certain future that, may someday come again, because of being in geographically in an area where Armenian state is surrounded with countries who occasionally continue attacks on the state, or are, let's say, not very friendly. So to be completely honest, there is not enough research to answer the question precisely about how people dealt with the trauma. What I have seen in the memoirs that I have gone through to work on my dissertation, there were a number of themes that would come up as important topics among the refugees. One of them was, for instance, the women who were abducted and then liberated and returned to the Armenian community. They had to deal with tremendous amount of trauma, right? They were first taken away from their families, then they became victims of rape. Many of them were impregnated. They gave birth to children whose father was the one that they saw as this criminal who had tortured them. And so when, for instance, these women were liberated and they had the opportunity to return to Armenian community, they faced this dilemma. What do we do? Do we leave this family and join the Armenian community, and by doing so abandon our children? Because those Muslim fathers were not going to give their children away. And some women stayed. And hence the population that some call hidden Armenians in today's Eastern Turkey, carrying that trauma, because one day a young Turkish guy learns from his grandmother that she's actually not just Turkish, but she is, a daughter of a mixed forced marriage. Yeah, there are many different questions of faith. For instance, after genocide, some Armenians were having issue going back to church. They couldn't understand how God would have let that happen to Armenians, while others saw church as the only place that would provide them with the feeling of safety and home. And so they created these communities around the church. But these are all different examples that I have encountered in my own research, and I'm not an expert on trauma, intergenerational trauma. So I hope one day we will have overwhelming, complete research on this to give a better answer to this question.
Yeah, but it's really very interesting because, of course, this trauma is also part of the collective memory of the people, of the country, of the nation. So I think this research is very, very important. And there is another question around those issues, as educators, how do you teach about this trauma, and how do you explain this issue of carrying that history, and we know it also from Holocaust history. We know that this trauma, intergenerational trauma, is also part of that collective memory of a nation. So I think that is another parallel that we can see, including the fear, I think, that you mentioned, which is something else that is triggering. You have an attack on a church, and immediately the trigger is those attacks, or attack on a synagogue, and the Jewish community will think about Kristallnacht, so you have those triggers of memory that you see. There is a question, and you started to speak about women, so maybe we can turn into this question. How did gender and age affect the experience of Armenian refugees? Were there specific challenge or coping mechanisms unique to women, to children? You gave some examples about children, or to the elderly?
Wonderful question. I always look forward to hearing a gender related question from audience. Absolutely, yes. It did matter. The experiences were different from each other. And it's interesting how, again, we can talk about Armenian women's experiences and parallels or differences when we're talking about the experiences during the Holocaust or during the genocide in Rwanda. Because one distinctive factor in Armenian genocide was that Armenian women and young children were seen as remakeable. That was a word that was used, that they could be corrected, that they could become proper Ottoman Muslims if the community took them in. That those were the words of the perpetrators. Of course, that's not how the women and children saw what that happened to them. But there was a governmental policy to create incentives for the community members to abduct those women and children. Even certain allowance was actually signed by the government to the local Kurdish, Arab, and Turkish families if they took in an Armenian child and an Armenian woman. So some of them even would want to do that for profit. It was not a lot, but still, it was an incentive. So we have these documents coming from different ministries in Ottoman Empire, from Interior, from Education, about incentives to take in Armenian women, to create schools for Armenian children. So this distinctive difference is that even though many women and children were targeted and killed, many also physically survived because they were taken to those orphanages or to those families. They were forcibly converted to Islam. Boys would be circumcised, and their names would be changed to Muslim names, both women and the children. And I also should mention that it's gender, but it's also about age, because in case of Armenian boys, mostly it was about boys of age 6 and under. Older boys would be killed. So they had certain standards of who was at an age that could be, trained and reformed, and who was not eligible for that anymore. It was different for women and girls. At all ages, they would be forced into speaking only Turkish or Kurdish. Many of the women, one of other experiences that women had was in, for example, Bedouin families where they were taken. Women would get tattoos on their bodies and faces. And that's like they were branded, they were the property of that family. And even though for some Bedouin families that was a normal practice, they didn't see it as something, it was not considered a torture or an unpleasant thing. But for Armenian woman carrying that tattoo on her body, especially on her face, even if she was rescued, that was going to stay with her all her life. I actually have several examples of women who, after they survived and were and escaped those families, they tried to study really hard and become doctors, surgeons, so that they could do plastic surgery and remove those tattoos. And of course, in that generation, many never really achieved that. But so it's when we talk about gender and how it affected the Armenian genocide, this is something that distinguishes Armenian genocide from, let's say, the experiences during the Holocaust. But it also creates those parallels with the genocide in Rwanda, for instance, where the rape and impregnation was part of the genocidal policy. And yeah, I mean, I could go on, I guess, forever talking about this, but probably I should stop and give a chance for another question.
Yeah, but it's really is interesting, this discussion on the targeting. There are some films about generations and the tattoo. I saw those films about the tattooing in the face, on the face, and forgot the name of the film. We showed it in our center. It was very, very
My
painful.
grandmother's tattoos, I think
That's
that's
it.
the one.
Yes,
Yeah.
my grandmother's tattoo. Very, very, very impactful. I would recommend for those that did not see the film to try and see it online.
Do you mind
Um,
me commenting on that?
yes,
I actually
please.
showed it in one of my classes when I was teaching a course on women and genocide. And it turned out that one of the students who was in the classroom, who had an Armenian last name, but was not very active before that in class, came up to me after we watched it and told me that she grew up in a home where the grandmother had those tattoos, and the grandmother never talked about it. So she grew up not understanding what they were, and she didn't really like them. She thought they were ugly, and most of the grandchildren didn't like that grandmother so much because she was always angry about something. After watching that movie, she went and did research on her own family story, and towards the end of the semester presented actually her family story and found some questions to what those tattoos that her grandmother had, what stories they told. She learned about the rape in it was just amazing to see how one source could create this interaction and engagement from a student that wasn't really very active in classroom and probably didn't expect anything like that.
That is amazing, and and that leads me to the last two questions that I want to ask you. Our time is basically running out, but how in Holocaust families, I'm thinking about myself as a second generation, my children as third generation. There is curiosity to know about the family's history. There is in many families, there is one child that is the memorial candle, as we call it, as Dina Vardi calls it, that is doing the research, that's doing the historical research, or putting the puzzle together. Is this a phenomenon that is happening more and more in the Armenian community? And does it happen more within the Armenian borders now as a proud independent country, not under the USSR? Or is it more in the diaspora? Can you speak a little bit about looking for your roots and your stories in families?
Well, because you brought that example, it's an important aspect of Armenian genocide to remember that after the genocide, most of the second or third generations didn't really have the opportunity to share their stories the way that the second gens or third gens of Holocaust survivors do. Partly because, those who spread all over the world, they were going through, the period of time in the world, which was the economically terrible time for anyone anywhere in the world, the Depression, and nobody was really interested in asking questions about the past because people were trying to deal with their every day-to-day problems. And in terms of Armenians in Armenia, as you mentioned, they were in Soviet Union where it was not allowed to talk about genocide. So they would be considered nationalists and sent to the gulags if they did that. So because of that, there were very few initiatives that mostly happened outside Armenia and mostly in North America, where a couple of scholars who were historians and themselves were second gens realized the importance of collecting the stories So they started these initiatives of going out and recording and asking questions. And luckily, we have those today. One of the first initiatives was by Richard Hovhannisyan, who himself was second gen, and being the founder of Armenian studies at UCLA, he also was a professor who assigned his students to actually do that project, go and record survivor stories. And again, it was not so professional. It was not like very good quality. Those were the cassettes that nobody today even knows what that is. But there were some of those initiatives. And when we talk about today, there is a very interesting thing right now happening among Armenians all over the world, including in Armenia, and that is connecting today's fate of Armenia with the genocide experience. Unfortunately, because of the ethnic cleansing that happened in Artsakh last September, people now are actually actively working on collecting testimonies of the refugee survivors from Artsakh. So it's like almost another tragedy happened over 100 years later that triggered a movement which was similar to the 20s and 30s, except today there is the technology, also the experience. So the know-how is there, and people are really trying to collect this information because we have the understanding, and now I'm saying we as an Armenian, that, and I say it also because my grandfather didn't tell his story. So I don't really have proper history of my own family while being a historian of genocide. But as a collective, it seems like most of Armenians realized immediately the importance of collecting these testimonies today, so that 50, 60 years later, we do not say we had these people who experienced this, who lived through blockade, through starvation, through exodus, and we didn't ask the questions, we don't have their stories.
And I think that is really, really important. And even if you do not know a lot about your grandfather, to take you as an example, as a historian, you can piece together, what town did he come from, what village, what more or less, and there is an importance of doing this and not letting it go. And I know that I was very inspired by two professors in Namibia next door. I'm coming from Johannesburg, from South Africa now, and two professors from Namibia that decided 120 years after the massacres of the Herero and Nama, there's no one alive anymore, testimonies were never taken, to go back to those villages, to go back to those descendants and actually start collecting the testimonies, whatever pieces of testimonies there are. And they published now one book about the Herero experiences and one book about the Nama experiences. And I think the fact that what you shared with us, those collections do exist, even if they are on tape recorders, even if they are, a kind of a grassroots community process of collecting the testimonies. They are important and they should continue. And with that, I'm afraid we have to close, but it does connect us to many of the questions about archival stories, about testimonies. Those questions did come from the audience today. But with that, Asya, I just want to really thank you for the sensitive way that you shared this complicated story with us and shining a light on testimonies and stories that none of us knew about, because, as you said, those archival sources were collecting dust. And you, through your process, brought to our attention really important story of resilience and of rebirth and re-education and creating families back with the Armenian identity intact despite the trauma that you spoke about. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for your contribution today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And Ellen, back to you.
Thank you. I will formally close us out for today. I couldn't have said it better, Tali, the way that you thanked Asya. These stories need to be amplified, and we thank you both for your expertise and insights. As we approach our final 2 sessions in our series on lessons in resilience from the Holocaust and genocide, we invite you to join for these insightful discussions that highlight the strength of the human spirit in the face of immense challenges, and also the new scholarship that emerges. On October 28th, Professor Paul Lowe will present Testimonies of Light, Photography Bearing Witness to the Siege of Sarajevo. Through his lens as a photojournalist, Lowe captured the resilience and courage of the citizens during the siege of Sarajevo. He will explore how photography can serve as a tool for memory, validation, and reconciliation in post-conflict societies. And then on November 20th, we'll conclude this series with Stories of Resilience, Learning from Survivors of the Holocaust and the 1994 Genocide in Rwanda, featuring Dr. Brown. This session will delve into the testimonies of survivors as they recount how they rebuilt their lives after experiencing genocide, connecting the lessons of resilience to our world today. As we enter this new year, let us embrace the spirit of renewal that Rosh Hashanah represents. Together, may we foster compassion, unity, and hope, not just within our communities, but across the globe. Thank you again for your participation and support. Wishing you all Shana Tova with peace, health, and resilience. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Shana Tova. Shana Tova, Pinchas.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.